Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Rebecca Munro and this is Scotland at 7. And apologies for the slightly later start today. But today I am joined with the campaign founder of Keep Scotland the Brand, Ruth Watson. Ruth, how are you this evening?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
No problem at all. It's great to have you. We'll start with our daily coronavirus update and then we'll get into the stories and questions later on. So, as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 2,540,108 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,183,689 have been confirmed negative. 356,419 have tested positive. There are 1,032 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 11 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,003. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 352 were in hospital last night, 40 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,029,479 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 3,357,803 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures up until yesterday show 130,503 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 146 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. On to our ONS update now. In the week ending the 31st of July 2021, COVID-19 infections in England decreased to 1.32%. The hospital admission rate remains similar at 7.05 per 100,000 people in the week ending the 1st of August. There were 389 deaths involving COVID-19 registered in England in the week ending the 30th of July. This is 81 more deaths than in the week before. There were 468 deaths involving coronavirus registered in the latest week, ending the 30th of July 2021, accounting for 4% of all deaths in the UK. This is an increase from 392 deaths in the week before. So our first story of the day is Results Day. The number of higher passes is at a record level since the advent of devolution, and the number of advanced higher passes is the highest since their introduction in 2001. Almost 137,000 learners are receiving Scottish Qualifications Authority results today, the most since 2017. Pass rates overall remain high, despite the exceptional challenges caused by the COVID-19 crisis, and are significantly higher than the historic picture, up 12.6 percentage points for Highers compared with 2019, but down slightly on last year. With an exam diet not possible because of the pandemic, this year's grades for National Fives, Highers and Advanced Highers were based on teachers' judgment of evidence of attainment. The results show the highest number of higher passes since at least 1999, the highest number of advanced higher passes since the qualifications were introduced in 2001, an increase in the number of entries for national qualifications compared with 2020, the percentage of grade A's awarded at National 5 higher and advanced higher level is at a record high. Pass rates at National 5 higher and advanced higher are higher than in 2019, although slightly down on 2020. The poverty-related attainment gap is narrower than in 2019, although slightly wider than in 2020. And now, here is a clip from earlier this morning at Lochgelly High School, where we interviewed Scottish Education Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville, Lochgelly High School's head teacher, Debbie Aitken, and two of her students. Let's take a look just now. You've committed to £400 million to education recovery, and you've introduced a support package for schools and mental health support for staff. So, first of all, what grade would you give yourself and your progress in A, B, C?
Well, I think it's very, very important that politicians never grade themselves and leave that to electorate. So obviously the government got a good grade at the last election, but we obviously stand ready to receive the electorate's judgment at any time. But I think politicians should leave those type of judgments to the electorate.
No problem. And do you think that these measures that have been implemented have and will genuinely help students across Scotland?
Well, the government's very, very determined to ensure that we have a strong COVID recovery within our schools, and that's exactly why we've backed it up with that £400 million worth of investment. That's why I made the announcement yesterday on additional teachers and support staff to ensure that we're supporting our young people through additional staff and that's exactly why we've delivered a fair and credible exam system so that young people can be reassured that regardless of what their results were today, that they can go into the next stage of their life with a great deal of pride in what they've achieved under the most difficult of circumstances.
Yeah, and education is also obviously more than just assessing academic potential. It's about developing new minds, new talents, and encouraging students to perhaps move out of their comfort zones a bit. So do you think that despite the obvious limitations, that the pandemic may have produced the most motivated and problem-solving generation with an exceptional kind of can-do work ethic?
Well, I heard directly from young people today about, they've spoken about their resilience, about their requirements to have to adapt to change, to be resilient, to have to self-study at home. Now that's been exceptionally difficult for our young people to do. They have done that under the most difficult of circumstances, but it's a true credit to them and to the resilience that they've came through this, and we've got results like we have today, record number of passes at higher, record number of passes at advanced higher, and that's all down to the resilience of our young people and their hard work, and of course to the staff who've supported them through that process.
Yeah, and are you reassured by the hugely positive open letter by leaders in Scottish businesses as well, that employers value the efforts and grades achieved by all this year's young learners? I think there's a few people that have thought they're maybe not credible. Is that a relief to you?
Well, it was great to see so many employers coming out and supporting our young people. I was very, very saddened to see, as young people were sitting their assessments earlier this year, that we had opposition politicians decrying the system, calling it an exams crisis, right at the time where actually people needed our support and our young people needed our support. So what you've seen is employers coming out and doing exactly that, saying you've got a fair and credible system, we trust the results you've got today, and we look forward to working with you in the future. And I think that was a really, really positive message for our employers. Perhaps politicians should take note from that positivity.
Yeah. And lastly, are you proud of the Scottish students this year overall?
I'm exceptionally proud of what young people have delivered under the most difficult of circumstances. They're circumstances which I hope no other young person will ever have to face in their education. It's a credit to them. I hope they've enjoyed their summer holidays. I hope they're looking forward to getting back to the new academic year as well and carrying on with their good work.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Thank you.
How challenging was it last year, given COVID restrictions, especially kind of moving from online, the kind of virtual reality of it all? Was that quite difficult?
Yeah, it was an exceptionally challenging year for the young people in particular, and our staff too, because obviously they didn't know. It was so unpredictable. You know, we had a number of young people who, for several different reasons, had to self-isolate, some on more than one occasion. And if they were in the year groups 4th, 5th and 6th year, then that presented a lot of challenges. So yeah, it has been an extremely challenging year, but also there are lessons that we've learned too, and a lot of positives that have come out of negatives, but equally a lot of hard work's gone in.
Yeah, and do you think, I mean, although you've done your best for the academics of the children, how do you feel about the school social life, you know, in terms of like concerts and that kind of thing? Is that something that you'll maybe focus on in the coming year?
Yes, definitely. I know that we have an exceptionally wonderful music department in the school, who, you know, where award ceremonies, our Christmas concerts, we have usually an Easter treat for some of our senior citizens in the local community, and a lot of the things had to be done virtually this session, and so it'll be absolutely wonderful to get back to being able to support our community face to face and have that social aspect back again.
Yeah, nice. And how was it personally as an individual to be responsible for a school of children during this time? Because obviously you'll have your own things with going on with COVID. How was it for you as a head teacher?
I think as a team of head teachers, the five head teachers work exceptionally well, and they're a very, very supportive team. And we're supported, you know, from Fife Council. However, just some days the actual stress levels were very high, you know, as you can imagine. Just sort of trying to get the very, very best outcomes, supporting the staff and supporting the young people as much as I could. So yeah, it has been a year. In my 21 years of teaching, I would say it's been the hardest year that I've experienced. Yeah,
and I mean, overall, are you proud of your students, and do you think they'll move into further education or jobs relatively well?
Absolutely. The pride, you know, and just the level of relief for them that they've put in that work and that it's been recognised with the outcomes. I am absolutely, really, it's heartfelt that, you know, that they've done their best, and that we do a lot in our school, not just for sort of higher education, but you know, supporting young people to go into apprenticeships and into the world of work. and so we've got something called the C.R. Smith Academy. So we work with sort of local businesses, and we've got mentors and so on that support the young people and their skills. But I think a lot of the skills that they've developed, information technology, resilience, creativity, individual responsibility. We've got 3 values in Lochgelly High School of respect, responsibility and resilience, and I think that more so than ever these are needed in this world that we find ourselves in.
So, did you guys get the results that you were hoping for, first of all? Yeah. Great. And I was wondering, because you obviously got predicted grades before, so were you nervous to get your results this time, or did you kind of already know what to expect?
There was still a sense of, obviously, nerves.
Yeah.
We were new sort of like a baseline of what was predicted for us, but obviously the SVA still could have changed grade boundaries or anything like that, so there was still like a few subjects that we could have had changes with.
Right.
So I think it was just really waiting for the confirmation that we did get our predicted grades.
Yeah, true. And how did you find the online learning experience, practical to virtual reality? How was that?
I think it was definitely tough, but it did allow us to learn different ways to do things, and our teachers were amazing, supporting us, doing video calls most days. They were answering any questions, we were available at any time, and they were amazing, and I think that was the only way it was possible for us to do so well.
Yeah, brilliant. And was it weird wearing a mask in school and not being able to see people's full faces?
Yeah, it was obviously, so to begin with, when we first came back, we were only required to wear a mask moving for class, and then that obviously changed, we had to wear it inside. Personally for me it made learning a bit more difficult. Obviously, you know yourself, people are speaking with masks, you struggle to hear what they're saying, it's a bit muffled, and obviously when you're under stress like you are with your exams and things, it didn't help, but everybody was really good for complying with it, and we all got there in the end, everybody wore it, so it was fine.
Yeah, and in terms of your social life as well, I mean 6th year is normally quite a social, both within school and without school, so how was that for you in terms, was it quite difficult, or did you actually find ways of kind of connecting with your friends?
Well, personally, it's only really starting now.
Yeah.
Usually we'd all get to sit together and things, but that wasn't the case this year. Obviously the seating was took away. We all had to sort of sit separately, and it was just sort of all little groups, so it made it really hard for us as a 6th year to be a big group and socialise, so it was quite challenging, and we found it just now that we've left over the summer that we've all sort of spent the time together.
Yeah, nice. And where are you both now going after 6th year?
So I'm heading to the University of Strathclyde to study pharmacy.
Brilliant. And yourself?
And I'm going to the University of Edinburgh to study medical science.
Oh, nice. So are you both quite excited to start the kind of uni experience and get it going, maybe getting a bit of that social, because there's a lot of concerts and stuff as well. You didn't get school concerts this year. Was that kind of, that you still had a school life, was it but slightly different this year in terms of school spirit?
So there's things like a prom, things like that. We never got a prom, and just small things that you wouldn't really think about that we've had to miss out on. So it'll be good to get away to uni now and hopefully experience some of that.
Start a whole new, Jenny. Well, thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you.
So, Ruth, in terms of the SQA results day, there has been some criticism of the widened attainment gap. So do you agree with Ross Greer of the Greens that today's exam results have been slightly marred by the growth in the attainment gap?
You know what, I think that probably today's not a day for political point scoring. There's a lot of youngsters who have achieved a remarkable amount in really difficult circumstances. Where I live in a wee town which probably is a pretty representative microcosm of Scottish society, where there's folk who have plenty and there's folk who have next to nothing. And I know that our local school did a huge amount of work to make sure that kids were as included as they could be, from sending them laptops and devices and trying to give ongoing support. But a lot of the time the attainment gap is seen in terms of if people, they may have had the devices, but they perhaps didn't have a quiet room in which to do the work that was needed, or so yes, there is social inequity, and that is something that needs to be addressed. But given the circumstances and given the short notice with which we were, teachers and politicians had to respond to delivering an education and a curriculum to a nation of children in circumstances not seen really since the 1920s or late 1900 19 teens. I think that really we need to sort of just perhaps stay the politicking and get on with recognising that yes, there are things we need to do, and as far as I'm aware, the Scottish Government has plans, for example, to make sure that every child has got a device on which to work. And that's a big start. I mean, I know that in my area, we were a bit miffed in some ways because Angus Council had a policy, and I understand why, of saying that if all children weren't able to attend classes, then classes should sort of only be done on a very low basis. So my teenage daughter who had significant exams this year, well, they weren't exams. She was getting perhaps 4 classes a week, and there would be work handed out. But pretty much for most of this year, she's been self-taught. And I understand, having spoken to the school to find out, if we were maybe missing some link or something, because I know that my niece is a teacher down in the south of England, and I know that she was doing her normal curriculum and her normal classes. So if she was meant to be in a class, and she was doing that, but from home, and the teachers were what I was told by the school is that the policy was that no child should be disadvantaged sort of through lack of access. So so in many ways, that's Ross Greer's argument shoved out the window. Except my daughter, benefits from the fact that she has parents who are educated and are pushy and have deeper pockets than some. And so we went out and we bought all the books that she needed for the curriculum, and sort of spoke to her about resources she could access, and tried to work with her. And she has a quiet room to work in. So I think that actually my experience of education departments is that from a policy point of view, they worked very hard to make sure that children were as protected from the equity gap as was possible. So yes, I think that there are a lot of things that we need to change to ensure that social justice is at the fore of everything that we do. But I think that Ross Greer is really, perhaps, he's shot an arrow, and I think it's an ill-judged and poorly aimed arrow to fire.
Yeah, well, we'll move on to our next story, which is about university places and celebrating young people. So the number of Scottish domiciled students being offered a place at Scottish universities is at a record high on SQA results day, up 10% to 31,070. University Application Service UCAS data shows the number of acceptances from the 20% most deprived areas in Scotland to UK universities increased by 7% to 4,700, also a record high. This year's statistics also currently highlight a 56% decrease in the number of acceptances to Scottish universities from applicants based in EU countries. Minister for Higher Education, Further Education and Youth Employment and Training, Jamie Hepburn, said the figures show that the number of people from the most deprived areas being accepted to university is at a record high. We want every young person in Scotland to have an equal chance of success, no matter their background or circumstances. The Children's Commissioner ahead of exam results day said that Scotland should celebrate everything that young people have achieved in the past 2 years of living through a pandemic. Writing today, Bruce Adamson said, "We should rightly celebrate young people's achievements, particularly when they have worked hard to achieve these results, despite the impact on their right to an education and disruption to SQA exams and assessments over 2 academic years." So, Ruth, the statistics show that Scottish students who have been offered university places is up by 10%. I mean, will this be beneficial to our education sector and ultimately our cultural and business sector as well?
I think that perhaps the 10% is a reflection of a reduction perhaps in international students coming over. I know that a lot of universities have found that students from the EU are not coming because Brexit has screwed so much up for so many of us. So that will reduce the international experience that our Scottish students will have at Scottish universities. However, I do think that the Scottish Government policy of ensuring that it is an incentive for Scottish students to go to Scottish higher tertiary education was a very clever and very well judged one, because it does mean that those students who go to students often settle in the town or area where they studied, because that's where they make connections and perhaps get their first job. So I think that it's been a very good way of stopping the brain drain from Scotland, the talent sort of dissipation from Scotland. So I think that, of course, yes, is going to be something which is very beneficial to Scotland, because we will have more highly educated people who are motivated to stay and develop ideas and talent and thought and philosophy in Scotland, and I think that is a good thing. But I do regret the loss of international students. Some of that will be down to COVID. I mean, I know that a lot of people. I've got friends in Asia who are rethinking coming over here, because some of them were so burned last year by paying university fees. I mean, literally sort of 25,000 pounds of university fees to come and do a science degree, and then being told that they have to do that virtually. So that may well have had an impact. We may see in 2 or 3 years down the line, once COVID has settled, those perhaps more distant students sort of having another look again.
So do you think then that this decrease of EU students will severely diminish the kind of cultural, diverse experience of university for students?
I think between a lack of university students coming from Europe and the lack of our students being able to go and study on Erasmus, then of course, Brexit was always going to diminish our nation culturally, and I think that it is horrific on many levels. My sentiments about Brexit have never been hidden. I think that it is a horrendous loss, and historically, Scotland has always been an international trading nation, especially on Europe. Especially sort of our philosophy, our trade, our expansion of horizons, and educational excellence has always included Europe. So, as far as I'm concerned, roll on independence and getting back into the European Union so that we can see our university students enjoying an international perspective once more.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, there has been an increase of students from deprived areas securing a university place. Do you think that this 7% increase will help eventually to close the attainment gap, particularly when these students maybe finish their degrees and secure high-paid employment?
Yes, of course. I think that we have to make sure that those students who leave are getting jobs more than being shelf stackers. Now, that's not an insult to shelf stackers, because quite frankly, without those key workers, where would we be? We need the food on our shelves. But I think that it is very hard for people to get the jobs that perhaps they have trained for. So perhaps what universities also need to do is to help students, as I think they already do, is to help students sort of be more creative in the ways in which they can use their degree to maximise their potential. And I think that discussions about, for example, some of the Commonweal policy discussions about a 4-day working week and a universal basic income, which is genuinely universal and not so basic, that actually would really free people up for helping them be creative about the chances that they take in perhaps being entrepreneurs and self-employed. But yes, I think that people being given people finding their way out of a historical perhaps perception that education or university is not a lived experience that they have within their family. I think that of course is got to be good, because actually we must never forget that there's value in education just for the sake of education.
Mm. Yeah, and many students as well, they've not just been studying for their exams, but they've also been volunteering to help neighbours and support friends and family with kind of tough issues, including bereavement and challenging isolation episodes. So, I mean, do you think employers as well are going to receive a bumper crop of fully rounded, altruistic and really bright potential employees with these new students that have gone through COVID?
I think the answer is we'll see. It is. I think that there is a lot of resilience. There's been a huge amount of resilience, and perhaps resilience that we had lost along the line. I mean, we're talking as though COVID is the first experience in the history of humanity of pandemic, and actually, the first in our history has been 50 years or so without pandemic, and sort of humanity, I think, had got used to some concept that we were above disease and we were beyond death, and so I think that perhaps we are relearning the lessons of our ancestors, and I think that is a good thing. I mean, in Scotland, we very much have this saying, will you see you next week? Aye, if I'm spared. Well, that saying came out of people living close to their own mortality. So I think that it is a good thing for students to perhaps be reconnecting with our cultural tenacity, and I think it's something we could all reflect upon. So yes, I do think that our employers of the future will have perhaps more creative ways of working that perhaps help address the climate emergency a bit more. Perhaps people are going to find it easier to make the case for working from home occasionally, or for working from home in different ways, and from being back in the office, because of course it is really crucial that youngsters at the beginning of their careers especially are in an environment where they can be actively mentored and develop those kind of societal understandings of the way in which we can move forward and develop connections.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll move on to our next story of this evening, and that is the privatising Channel 4, which is not in the public interest. Privatising Channel 4 will weaken its ability to deliver programmes in the public interest, Cabinet Secretary for Culture Angus Robertson has said. Following a meeting with Channel 4 Chief Executive Alex Mahon, Mr Robertson said he strongly supports the public service broadcasting system and the unique role Channel 4 has in investing in and supporting development of the independent production sector. The Cabinet Secretary met Ms Mahon to hear details about the channel's wider plans following the launch of a consultation on privatisation by the UK Government's Department of Culture, Media and Sport. Mr Robertson added, "It was helpful and instructive to have the chance to talk about the future of Channel 4 with Alex Mahon. It is clear to me that if the channel is sold to the private sector, Scotland will lose the strong momentum and valuable partnerships that it has built with our creative sector." So, Ruth, will Channel 4 be able to continue to inform and educate and entertain if the bedrock of the public interest, if it's privatised?
Well, what's interesting there is that perhaps unconsciously you've actually given the motto for the BBC, sort of as it's raison d'être, and actually I see a real parallel there, because in the old days, back when I worked for the BBC in the 1980s and 90s, the BBC was, I think, from my personal professional experience, ahead of Channel 4 in its independence of thought and its the way in which the professional way in which it put out programs. I think Channel 4 does an extremely good job of doing that. And what I see now is that after 25, 30 years of the BBC being eviscerated to the point that it is now not just a puppet, but some sort of like a grotesque puppet of the carcass of a poodle stuck on a stick dancing to Mr. Johnson's tune. And I think that is what the UK government intends to do to Channel 4, because Channel 4 is the last bastion of independent journalism in the UK. I think the only other place that you could go to find independent journalism really in the UK would be Al Jazeera, and that's because it doesn't come out of it doesn't come out of London. And I think that it is very worrying, because when you look at the Press Freedom Index, the UK has tumbled. I mean, absolutely cascaded down. I think it used to be back at 14, back when I first heard about it, sort of in the late 1990s. I used to be very involved with the National Union of Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists. And at the time, there was a big move to try and get an International Federation of Journalists office in Algeria, which at the time was going through a terrible, brutal civil war. Civil unrest, I guess you would call it, but it felt like war to the families there. And so that was when I became aware of the International Press Freedom Index. And we were about 14, and if memory serves, and it may not because I'm a bit foggy at the moment, I'm afraid, through a bit of illness, but I think we're down at 32. And there's only 44 countries on the index. I mean, Westminster has absolutely destroyed the BBC, and they are doing their best to destroy Channel 4. And make no bones about, don't kid yourself on that it's not even down to their neoliberalist policies. This is about a further power grab, and it's actually going to be extremely dangerous to democracy. And anybody who is interested in the history of despots and totalitarianism would do very well to watch with great caution what is happening, because you just have to look at other nations and the way in which they have progressed regressive and oppressive policies. And the first thing they do is seize the media, and this is what this government is trying to do. There would have been very little about proroguing Parliament on our screens had it not been for Channel 4. There's an awful lot we need to be very, very worried about. So I love the BBC, and I'm horrified when I see what has become of it. And I think that we lose Channel 4. But when we lose Channel 4, if we lose Channel 4, we lose something significant, and I think we would be in even more dangerous days for democracy.
I mean, Channel 4 launched in the 80s with programmes like The Tube, which was revolutionary for younger generations at the time. So, I mean, what does this say then about the future and the direction that the UK is now moving in if they're wanting to privatise a people's station?
I sat watching the first ever programme on Channel 4 when it came out, and sat astonished at the word and magenta and just all this kind of programmes that came out, the F word being said for the first time, first lesbian kiss, it was all happening on Channel 4. And I think that that's the thing, it is there to be progressive and to push boundaries and to speak truth to power. And I can't say strongly enough that we should be protecting Channel 4 with every inch of our being if we value free speech in this country, because we are losing free speech. I mean, you've got Priti Patel looking at imprisoning journalists who embarrass the government. I mean, really, we're in North Korean territory here, and it has to be resisted at every possible turn.
Yeah, true. Well, we'll move on to our next story of the evening, and that is that Prince Andrew sued by Jeffrey Epstein accuser over alleged sexual abuse. Prince Andrew was sued in a New York court yesterday by a woman who alleged that he had sexually assaulted and battered her 2 decades ago when she was 17 years old. Virginia Giuffre, who says she was trafficked for sex by the late financier Jeffrey Epstein, filed a civil complaint against Andrew in the US District Court in Manhattan. The prince said in an interview with the BBC in 2019 that he had no recollection of meeting Giuffre and denied her claim of sexual abuse. At the time, a widely circulated photograph showed both Giuffre and Andrew standing next to each other, smiling. Soon after the BBC interview, Andrew stepped down from royal duties as charities and other organisations distanced themselves from him. "I am holding Prince Andrew accountable for what he did to me," Giuffre said in a statement. "The powerful and rich are not exempt from being held responsible for their actions." Giuffre sued Andrew under the Child Victims Act, a New York state law allowing many child abuse victims to pursue claims against their alleged abusers, even if the abuse occurred decades earlier. A window to bring in such claims expires this week. Spokespeople for Andrew's lawyers could not be reached for comment. So, Ruth, I mean, a prince is not above the law. I mean, he's allegedly refused to talk to federal investigators in New York or at a location of his choosing in London. I mean, is this just another example of a rich, privileged white man using his influence to avoid scrutiny?
Aye, but I bet he's sweating now. It's and rightly so. He, I saw on Sky News one of the lawyers who is acting for several of the complainants against Jeffrey Epstein and, of course, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, um, who was saying that he thought that in order for the case to proceed and for extradition, for example, to be pushed, the papers would have to be served on Andrew. And I don't know if I'm calling him by his first name, like I know him or like him, but I mean, but Mr. Windsor, um, and um, and that he thought it unlikely that the palace would cooperate with that, and he thought also that there would be diplomatic ramifications. Um, I guess the thing is, I mean, up here in Angus, we've got the Queen's nephew, or one of her relatives, a cousin or a distant cousin, who's just been released early after a charge down at Glamis Castle that he fairly brutally attempted a sexual assault on one of the house guests in his castle. He did go to the jail. I mean, perhaps we should send Prince Andrew up to Forfarshire of Court and see how they handle him, because they managed to give the Queen's cousin give him a wee spot and socked him for 6 months. And I think that perhaps it will never come to anything, but with Ghislaine Maxwell due to give evidence and perhaps plea bargaining being the thing, I mean, maybe more information will come out. But I don't think that Prince Andrew will ever face justice. I don't think the man thinks that he's done anything that was below his station. I suspect that part of him that actually just thinks that, prima nocte, he can do what he wants. And it seems to be sort of like, there's a seam of the Etonian sort of that kind of character who seems to have a sense of privilege, and Andrew has lived the life of a playboy all his days and has not been really held accountable for anything. But then, when you've got that much money, how many people do we see really being held accountable? And yet you have somebody who's 10 minutes late for a universal credit meeting, and they lose all their income. They can lose their house. Some of them take their lives. They can end up in prison for what? Because they haven't paid their TV license. So I think that perhaps things like this do make people look a little askance, and yet again think, is this the kind of barely post-feudal society we want to be living in?
Yeah, and I mean, we have to take as well cognizance of Virginia Giuffre at the time of the alleged sexual abuse, because to sue is her last option to readdress the power imbalance, as it seems Prince Andrew will never cooperate with the authorities. But for women who have been subjected to sexual abuse, I mean, how will this look to them? What message is this sending that they can't get him to cooperate?
But it's the same message that women who have been sexually abused and who have lived through abuse have known all their days. Is it 96%? Maybe that may not be correct, but I'm fairly sure I was chatting to a friend who was a doctor, and she said that 96% of the cases of sexual assault and sexual abuse that she says are seen in Scotland don't ever make it to court. I mean, most people, because you're in a situation where there's a he says, she says, or a he says, or she says, or they say scenario, then it's extremely hard to take these things anywhere. So yes, it takes a huge amount of bravery to stand up and say "Me Too," and most I guess the only difference now is that we're talking about it, whereas perhaps in the past we would never have been talking about it. And but I think that there's a huge amount. I mean, to be honest, I'd been much more impressed with Ross Greer if he'd been coming out talking about this as a kind of societal injustice we needed to address, because yes, I was actually watching Andrew Cuomo give his resignation speech today. Now, I don't know the guy. I wasn't there. He may be the biggest liar in the world, but he gave an extremely impressive resignation speech talking about the ways in which standards and respect and the rights of individuals, women in particular, because women are the more vulnerable of the sexes, to be to be respected and not to be facing sort of generalized everyday sexism that perhaps people didn't think were sex, like a touch on the shoulder or a touch in the waist, or and I thought it was actually an extremely impressive. I'm sure he didn't write it himself. I'm sure he had a team who wrote it for him, but it was an extremely impressive speech. And I found myself looking at it thinking, oh, those days. I'm old enough to remember the days when politicians gave resignation speeches and resigned when they behaved badly. And maybe one day we will see somebody who has come from an extremely privileged background being hauled off to serve time at His Majesty's pleasure. But there you go. I mean, even that very phrase tells you why we're never going to see Prince Andrew behind the jail, isn't it? I mean, at His Majesty's pleasure sees him sitting in a palace, living the life of luxury, paid for by us suckers. You know what I mean? His Majesty's pleasure means his Moss keeping him safe back in their back room. Yeah, can you imagine how many Glasgow mammies might be keeping their sons safe from the bolus? And yet, if they get caught hiding them in a back room, they'll get the jail too. I'm quite sure that's not going to happen to Old Bet. But sorry, I'm becoming quite revolutionary in my old age.
That's no problem. Well, we'll move on to our next story of the evening, and that is the $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which wins enough votes to pass US Senate. A $1 trillion infrastructure package that is a top priority for US President Joe Biden was secured enough votes to pass in the Senate on Tuesday, a bipartisan victory for the White House. Polls show that the drive to upgrade America's infrastructure, hammered out by a bipartisan group of senators over months of negotiations, is broadly popular with the public. The bill still has to go to the House of Representatives. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer aims to follow the bill with a budget resolution laying the groundwork for $3.5 trillion to be spent on healthcare, climate change, and other Biden priorities that Democrats will almost certainly have to pass over Republican objections. Once the resolution is adopted, Democrats will begin crafting the reconciliation package for a vote on passage after they return from their summer break in September. Months of work remain before the measure will go to Biden's desk to be signed into law. The budget plan would provide various Senate committees with top-line spending levels for a wide range of federal initiatives, including helping the elderly get home health care and more families afford early childhood education. It also would provide tuition-free community college and foster major investments in programmes to significantly reduce carbon emissions blamed for climate change. So, Ruth, do you think President Biden is a slightly more skilled negotiator than Trump, and therefore other bipartisan bills will perhaps go through the Senate and the House of Representatives, or is this, do you think, a one-off deal?
Seriously, just look at the history of the two different men. You've got Joe Biden, who is standing up and making passionate speeches condemning apartheid at a time when America was just barely coming out of its own versions of apartheid. And you've got Donald Trump, a man who pleaded mythical, fictitious heel spurs to try and avoid taking the draft. It's they're chalk and moldy cheese. And yes, I think what we're seeing now is that there's a grown-up back in the White House, and we'll see what they do with it. It's yes, it would be fantastic to think that actually they start passing progressive policies and the kind of progressive policies they were voted in to put through, and perhaps that will persuade people enough to sort of skim the majority of reasonable thinking voters off, because in the middle of it all you've still got all this mad bam pottery going on around Trump, but perhaps perhaps if there are grown-ups back in charge taking care of business and making people's lives better, the majority of people will stop and have a look and think, well, okay, maybe this is the direction we want America to take. Because I think that we really have to be very, very serious when we look at what's happening with global politics at the moment. There are agents of mischief at play, and those agents of mischief, I think, to be honest, we see them among us as well in Scotland, among certain parts of our society. I think there are government agents or agents from other powers who are determined to try and destabilize Western democracy, who are determined to try and destabilize progressive politics, and it may well be that the motive for that is yet to be revealed. But I do suspect that there are geopolitical heavyweight players looking at the shifting ground of global power, and I think that we are seeing that at play. And I think that some of the work that's been done, looking at, for example, by Carol Cadwalader, the great hack on Netflix I'm often referencing, but I think that we need to look at the way in which we are being played, by bloggers and by advertising and by news agencies that are no longer independent. I think we have to be extremely careful about the messaging that we are getting, and I hope that Biden is strong enough and a skillful enough politician to be able to lead America away from the mad precipice that it is teetering upon.
Yeah. Well, we've reached our last story of this evening, and that is that the Taliban told the Afghan government installed by force will go unrecognised. A US peace envoy to Afghanistan has warned the Taliban that any government that comes to power through force in Afghanistan will not be recognised internationally after the hardline Islamist movement captured 5 out of 34 provincial capitals in less than a week. As the Taliban consolidated its hold across a swath of the country's north and pressed attacks across the country, the US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad told the Taliban that there was no point in pursuing victory on the battlefield because a military takeover of Kabul would guarantee they would be global pariahs. His hope is to persuade Taliban leaders to return to peace talks with the Afghan government as US and NATO forces finish pulling out from the country. According to the EU, about 400,000 Afghans have been displaced by the fighting in recent months. Yesterday, the US said it was up to Afghan security forces to defend the country after Taliban militants captured a 6th provincial capital, Farah. In Farah province, along with other border towns and trade routes, confirming the latest city to fall, a local official told The Guardian, Farah is finished, it fell to the Taliban. During the past 2 months, the Taliban has rapidly expanded the territory it controls, including a large proportion of rural areas. A third of the country's provincial capitals are under threat. Earlier today, the Taliban military chief released an audio message to his fighters ordering them not to harm Afghan forces and government officials in territories they had conquered. It was not immediately clear if Taliban fighters on the ground would heed these instructions. There have been reports by civilians fleeing Taliban advances of schools being burned down and repressive restrictions on women. So Ruth, if Kabul collapses, neighbouring countries are fearful of protracted war. I mean, the Financial Times big read story said that terrorist organisations will have latitude. Some of the Taliban will be perfectly happy to turn a blind eye. I mean, are locals right to be terrified?
Yes, of course. I mean, the last time the Taliban were in charge, it was horrific. It was absolutely brutal, and this. I mean, the history of Afghanistan is not going to be covered by us in 6 minutes, but Afghanistan was doing quite fine, thank you very much, until other countries started messing around, and between the Russians invading because it was a strategic point. Well, I mean, let's go right back to 100 years ago, when the UK invaded it. But then Russia came in, because there was this kind of like happy middle sort of point where things seemed to be quite calm and relatively calm. And then the Russians came in, and then of course the UK and America and others decided to arm the Taliban, or arm insurrectionists. And then that's where the Taliban grew from that. The word Taliban comes from talib, which is the word for book or for learning. And the problem is that many of the Taliban believe that they're fighting a holy war for like a holy place. It's not just about it's not just about sort of them wishing to understandably kick an invader out of their country. It is, many of them were refugees from previous countries marching through and doing terrible things to their people and their language and their heritage and their culture. And the irony is that many of the Taliban at the time, when they first came to power, couldn't actually read. So they were taking their understanding of Quranic teachings from some very sort of far extreme Wahhabists from Saudi Arabia, who taught them a fairly distorted version, many would say, of Islam, and from that grew the Taliban. And it is horrific what will be done, and what will be done in the name of a religion that actually doesn't preach the things that are being done. And it is horrific. My only hope, from terms of sort of the stability for the region, is that people have seen it before, and they don't want to go down that route. And my understanding, although it may be incorrect, is that Al Qaeda and the people behind ISIS, and Boko Haram, all of these groups, they kind of sort of seem to be a bit like really gruesome versions of characters out of Monty Python, in to that minimalizes it terribly. But it's kind of like, it's my kind of Islamic Islamic extremism is more pure than yours. So actually there's kind of a lot of territorial infighting between them. But make no mistake, we will see women being removed from public places and forced back into their houses. We will see men forced to wear beards. We will see gay men flung from the top of mosques or burned alive. We will see children mutilated, and we will see decades of war and suffering and loss going backwards. And for what? It is appalling. And yes, you cannot ignore the reverberations that will be felt just across the Islamic world, not just across people who don't quite know where their place is in a Western world which seems not to want them. But I think that we will see this in terms of a general humanity, and I think that the world should look around, and really, we have to address our post-colonialist urge to race into countries that we think are useful to us under the guise of humanitarian mission. But what has been done to Afghanistan and to Iraq and to places which have been invaded and abused and abandoned, it is a cultural and historic crime that history will judge us extremely critically, and rightly so.
Well, sadly, that is all we have time for this evening. But thank you, Ruth, so much for coming on tonight's programme. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you and hear your thoughts on all of the different subjects.
Thank you for having me.
It's no problem. And thanks to everyone watching at home. If you would like to support Broadcasting Scotland further, then just follow the link at the bottom of your screen just now. The more who support us, the more programmes we can make for you. So thanks again to Ruth for joining us, and thanks again to everyone at home for joining us. Have a good evening.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. If I went to BBC Scotland and I said, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, Yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.